now, but it happens to be that tonight is the Yahrzeit of Rabbi Soloveitchik, which is one of the reasons, and then I had to also obviously include him in the shir. So the learning will be for Leil Nishmato. I also have a friend who has Yahrzeit for his father, and his name is Moshe ben Raphael, and he's in a hotel, and he suddenly realized the hotel is not letting him light a Yahrzeit candle. So he contacted me not that long ago and asked me, could we light a Yahrzeit candle? So I said, sure. And I said, you know what? I'm also saying a shir, so we'll also have your father in mind. Okay, so let us begin. Right now, some of us have already counted the third day of the Omer. Some of you are still on the second day of the Omer. It's also interesting, when exactly Rabbi Soloveitchik passed away, there are various pieces of information out there in different places. They don't all say the same thing. From what I recall and what I think is the fact, is I think he passed away on a Thursday evening, just like it is right now, at least here in Israel, it's a Thursday evening, which was already dark, so it was already the next day in terms of the Hebrew day. And let me just share with you. Here is a picture of the tombstone, which it says Hagon HaChassid Rabban Shel Yisrael. So that's quite a title already. The Rabbi of all of Israel. Maran Yosef Dov ben Hagon HaChassid Maran Moshe Levi Soloveitchik Nistalek Yeshiva Shamala Erev Shabbat Kodesh Yom Sheni Dechol HaMoed Pesach Yud Chet Nisan Hey Tavshin Nun Gimel. Based on this, it says in a bunch of places that he must have passed away on, I believe it was April 9th, but I think it's more likely it was still the previous day in terms of the Gregorian calendar. I think it was April 8th still. Therefore, I wrote, shir to commemorate the Yahrzeit of Morenu Rabbenu or Rabban Shel Yisrael of Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. If that's what they decided to write on the tombstone, so why would I write anything else? And let's begin. The Mishnah in Menachot, and I'll add one thing about this before we proceed. I learned this Mishnah, I learned this Gemara with Rav Soloveitchik. So one of the years I was in the shir, he was teaching Menachos or Menachot. I believe I may have the Bechina, the test that he gave us at the end of the semester. If anybody wants to try to take the test to see if you would pass his test, I believe I have that someplace. Also, when I got engaged, my in-laws, who were very nice Jews, but not learned, and they had a friend who had smicha, and he said, "Oh, he's a yeshiva student. He's whatever." He goes, "I'll give him a faher," which means he'll give me a test. So he gets himself invited over for lunch on Shabbos. I was there for Shabbos. So first question is, what are you learning? My answer is Menachos, and that was it. That was the end of the test. If you're going to go back to the four sons, he was Enul de Elishol. He had no idea what to ask about Menachos. He had a Hail Mary, which was stuff about tefillin. I said, no, stuff about Menachos. Stuff about the Omer. The Sugya is all about the Omer. So now, the Mishnah, this is like, I'm going to start with the tail end of the Mishnah, that there were certain things that were done in a very demonstrative way in order, so that's exactly where we're picking up now. Shalosh pamim akol davar davar v'hein omrim lo hein, right? Is it Shabbat? Yes. Is it Shabbat? Yes. Is it Shabbat? Yes. And nonetheless, is this a sickle? Yes. Kol kach lama. Why all of this pomp and circumstance? Why of all of this exaggeration? It says b'nei Baitussim. It is because of the Baitussim. Shahayu omrim ein ktsira ta'omer b'mitzah yom tov. Okay. The first consideration, and I'm not interested right now in getting into each and every argument because there are going to be too many of them. The Baitussim thought that things should be done different. Now, first thing you may ask me then, who are the Baitussim? Here it's with a mem. Who are the Baitussim? So it's a sect that existed towards the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, the second temple. And further, the Gemara here tells us, Shahayu Baitussim Omrim Atzeret Achar HaShabbat. And I'm going to just say this additionally, one of the opinions of the Baitussim is that they're the ones who believed that Atzeret, that Shavuot should always be on a Sunday. Now, before I proceed, I just want to say a couple of things, really much more as an introduction. There are Baitussim and there were Tzedukim, or there were Tzedukim and there were Baitussim. And I think that we have a hard time sometimes distinguishing between the two, and maybe we really can't distinguish. The other things that you need to know is that the Gemara itself is censored and also suffers from self-censorship. So maybe you could say suffers from self-censorship or suffers from censorship, but whenever you're going to deal with, I'll use the word dissidents or others, we always need to be careful what was the original term that was used, which means they live in a world where they're idolaters, they live in a world where they're Christians, they live in a world where there are non-believers, and sometimes they had to be careful either in the Gemara itself or Mishnah itself, or sometimes later on before, as the manuscripts are being passed on or before something gets published, which means anytime you're going to get to, I'll go back. Anytime you get to any of these terms, what you're going to need to do is to take a look and to see if the various manuscripts support the text that we have in our printed books. And very often you're going to find that there is intrigue. As I said, some censorship, some self-censorship, sometimes we're being careful, sometimes too careful, and over here, nonetheless, it says Baitussim. Not every time the Baitussim or the Tzedukim are referred to will it say one or the other. Sometimes there'll be a different term completely, but as I said, that's enough of an introduction now to understand this. In this case, it did in fact say that we were concerned about the Baitussim, and then it goes on to tell us something about the Baitussim, and they were concerned that Chag Shavuot should always come out on a Sunday. Nitpal lahem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is somebody who is towards the end of the Second Temple and after the Second Temple. Presumably this is when the Second Temple is still standing. And it says that Nitpal behem, he goes and has a word with them, and V'mar lahem, and he says to them, Shotim, idiots. Now, some of you can say that's not so nice. Minayin lachem. V'lo haya adam echad shehaya mishivo. And no one was willing to engage. We'll see one exception in a moment. No one is willing to engage. So, you know what? This is great. Again, Rabbi Soloveitchik will be in the background of everything that we say today. Can you imagine somebody with limited understanding and limited knowledge and limited background trying to talk to the Gadol Hador, trying to talk to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? I mean, it's a complete absurdity. And once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai engages, they seem to have enough sense to all back down. And then it says chutz, with the exception of Zaken Echad. There was one elderly fellow there. Shahaya mitparteit kenegdo. Mitparteit is not a good word. He starts to chirp, as it were, kenegdo v'amar, and he says the following: Moshe Rabbeinu OUisrael haya. Moshe Rabbeinu loved Jews. V'yodea shatzeret yom echadu. And he knew that Chag Shavuot is only one day. Amad v'tikna achar Shabbat kidei shu Yisrael mitangin shnei yamim. And therefore Moshe decreed that Chag Shavuot should be always on a Sunday, so we're always going to get a long weekend. In Israel, they have a term for this. They call it a gesher, a bridge. So this is a long weekend, and this is the Baitussim position. And by the way, notice that that Moshe wanted the Jews l'taneg, to enjoy, to have pleasure, to have a long weekend, to have some more time off. Now, again, let's speak more about a temple-oriented celebration. You're going to be Ola Regel, you're going to come to Jerusalem, so why just come and go? Already you're going to go on vacation. You want at least a couple of days. Now, I hope you all realize that there's something completely preposterous about this. Not just preposterous, it's completely shocking. We generally give the credit to the Baitussim or the Tzedukim, that they believed in Torah Shebechtav, but they don't believe in Torah Shebal Peh. They believe in the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. If I'm not mistaken, what I just now read, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu loved Jews, and therefore Moshe didn't write Sefer Vayikra. God wrote Sefer Vayikra. if this claim is an accurate claim of what all Baitussim held, now you see what I just now did. I just shifted it from one elderly man who's giving forth an argument versus the position of all Baitussim, then their position is worse than we ever imagined, because it means complete heresy in terms of not just the oral Torah. This is a rejection of the divine authorship of the written Torah as well. Now, the first answer of Yochanan ben Zakkai responds, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. Somebody who's interested can read further here. So he says, "Kara alav mikrazeh." He reads a pasuk, "Achadasar yom michorev derech har seir." The amount of travel it should have taken to get from Har Sinai to Eretz Yisrael was 11 days. If Moshe Rabbenu OUisrael haya, if Moshe loved Jews so much, Icharan b'midbar barim shana, did he cause them to delay for 40 years in the desert? He goes, what are you talking about? Now, and by the way, Amr lo Rebbe b'kachata patrani, he goes, that's your answer to me? Amr lo shota. And he goes and he doubles down on him and calls him an idiot again. And I'm not going to read through the entire text over here. I am just telling you is that if this were a serious discussion, we can have it in a serious way. This is not a serious discussion. This fellow's starting point is that Moshe Rabbeinu made up the Torah, and the major point of the Torah is to have vacations and long weekends and go off to Club Med. So please, this is just a complete absurdity, and you don't answer absurd positions in a serious way, which is apparently what Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai does. And I want to stress another thing, and we've in the past had a whole shir on the following point. If you look at source number 2, and then we'll look at source number 3, you're going to. This is Parshat Emor. This is where the Omer is introduced. So it's talking about the holidays. First one which is introduced, which is strange. Shabbat, by the way, is not land-oriented. It's all over the world. It's all over the place. But on Shabbat, there will be a cessation of work. It's a Shabbat. It's a day of rest. Then the holidays are introduced. Right? New paragraph. Elamodei Hashem, Mikrei Kodesh. And it says, we're skipping Barasah l'Chodesh, Bein Rabbi Pesach l'Hashem. B'chamisha Sayom l'Chodesh Shazeh, Chag HaMatzot l'Hashem. Right there, you're told there's no work on that first day. Moving a little further, on the seventh day, there is a cessation of work. By the way, that would be a Shabbat because there's no work which is being done. It then continues, Ki tavo la'aretz, you enter the land, which I'm going to give you, and it introduces the Omer. And here, maybe I didn't underline the key phrase, but it's more than once here. Mimachrat Shabbat, the day after the day of rest. Now, the day of rest in this case, here's the argument that you could say, hold it. Maybe the Baitussim have a good point. Maybe it is Machrat Shabbat, so therefore it's going to start for Machrat Shabbat. You're going to count 49 days later, it'll be Machrat Shabbat, and therefore what you're talking about will be a Sunday. So the argument maybe is a pretty good argument. The only problem with this is, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit further, we're going to get to the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah. Why does that mean that it has to be on a Saturday? Now, just stay with me a second. Which is what makes it a Shabbaton. Yom Kippurim. And what does it say about what is that? Pasuk Lamed Bet, Shabbat Shabbatanu Lachem. Now, there's no way that both the 1st of the month and the 10th of the month could be a Saturday. On top of all that, you're going to get to the 15th of the month, and it's going to say as well that Chamisha Asar Yom L'Chodesh V'Echad K'Sot Shabbat Yomim L'Hashem B'Yom HaRishon. It's going to tell us again B'Yom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh Kol Melachad Avodah Lo Ta'asu. So again, you have a cessation of work on that day. And notice also in Pasuk Lamed Chet, Milvad Shabbatot Hashem. All these kinds of days of cessation of work. By the way, later on we're going to read in Pasuk Lamed Tet, Ach b'chamisha sayom l'chodesh shvi b'asfechem et tvuat ha'aretz t'chogu chag l'Hashem shiva yamim b'yom harishon Shabbaton u'v'yom hashmini Shabbaton. So it is virtually impossible for the 1st and the 10th and the 15th, right, and the 21st, all of them to be Saturdays, which means now you realize that the word Shabbaton or Shabbat does not mean exclusively Saturday. It means a cessation of work. And right afterwards, in source 3, in chapter 25, we're going to have Shemitah, which is called V'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat Lashem. That's not just on Saturday. U'v'shanat ha'shvi'it Shabbat Shabbaton yeh la'aretz Shabbat Lashem. And again, I can go and so on and so forth, because essentially the word Shabbat does not mean Saturday. It could mean Saturday. It means a day of rest. It means a day of cessation of labor. So the argument of the Baitussim, which, by the way, he doesn't even put forth that argument. That's what's so good. And again, I want to be a little careful. Again, I don't know. Okay, don't be mad at me now. I don't know to what extent we should be taking the argument of Chazal in a literal sense, or perhaps there's a polemic which is taking place over here. I mean, we know that there's such a thing as a midrash, and we don't read all our midrashim literally. So over here as well, is this really the absolute position of all the Baitussim? If it is, as I said, then their case is far worse. I don't even have to make this argument, because they don't make the counter argument. They don't say, hold it really means Saturday. They didn't say that. They said, no, it has to be Saturday for a different reason, and that is because Moshe loved the Jews and wanted to give us long weekends. So I'm just saying there's no serious discussion over here taking place. But even if they took the more serious discussion and would insist, no, Pshat in the Torah, Mechrat HaShabbat, needs to mean, absolutely, it has to be Saturday night or Sunday. So my counter to that would be, well, that's just not true in terms of the text, because the Pshat, again, we've used the word Pshat many times, that Pshat is a contextual understanding, and contextual understanding is obviously dependent on the context, and in this particular case, we need an operational definition of the word Shabbaton, and the operational definition of the word Shabbaton cannot mean Saturday, looking at all the way that's used in chapter 23. So essentially, there's no argument, there's no discussion to be made. So I don't know, again, that would have been the more serious discussion. One side would say Mimrachot Shabbat would be literal, and Pshat is a literal translation, and the other one would say no, the Mimrachot Shabbat is a contextual translation, and on the context over here, Shabbaton doesn't mean Shabbat. But that's not the argument that the Baitussim gave. The argument that he gave was a far worse argument, was that God wanted us to have long weekends, and God wanted us to enjoy. And I'm stressing that a little bit because I think if we start putting together the sources, we're going to notice that maybe there is a common denominator that has eluded us, and I want to make sure that we get to see it and we understand it. In source number 4, the same theme is carried through if you understand it and if you see it. We're told in Rosh Hashanah, then the Mishnah tells us originally, B'Rishona, Hayu Makabim Eidut HaChodesh Mikol Adam, that originally they would take the testimony from everyone, and at some point they stopped. Tana Rabbanan, Ma Kilkulu Kikulul Baitussim. And it goes on and tells us, by the way, the word Baitussim I do not believe is in the Mishnah. I have to go back and take a look. The word Baitussim is not in the Mishnah. Look at source 6, it's the Yerushalmi. Im ein makirin oto mishalmim oto mishalchin imo acher la'ido. If the court does not know this fellow, you send someone else who knows. The court knows them, and they know this fellow, witness. B'rishono yimakavlim eider chodesh mikol adam mishakilkulu haminim. Now, minim is much more generic, and minim could mean all kinds of things. Sometimes minim means Christians. Sometimes minim means heretics. Sometimes minim could mean something else. But that's what I'm pointing out. The Mishnah here only said minim. The Mishnah here did not say Baitussim. And now, if we go back to the Gemara, and it says, "B'rishonim hayu mekalim mikol adam tana rabbanon ma kilkul kikol Baitussim." What were the Baitussim guilty of? Which, by the way, would therefore suggest that maybe the Mishnah here originally said Baitussim, and that's the text which is there in front of the rabbis when they are considering this tradition. So it says that once they tried to bribe someone, Bikshu Baitussim la'totel chamsachru shnei bnei adam ba'arba ma'od zuz echad mishalon ve'echad mishlahem mishlahem id edutov etzlanu amrlo, and it tells them exactly what to say. He goes and he travels to Yerushalayim, and they say, "What did you see?" Amalem ola hayiti b'malei adumim. I was out in Malei Adumim, or itibshu ravutz ben shnei slaim, and he gives this really remarkable testimony, and they're kind of having a hard time believing him. and again, I'm not reading the whole thing over here, and he finally says at the end, and you don't believe me, that's what I saw, Hare Matayim Zuz, Tzurim Li B'Sidnini, and he goes, and here's the money they paid me to say this testimony. So, Amrulo, and he says, who? So then it comes out that it was the Baitussim. Here you see it again. It was Shamati Shabikshu Baitussim Latotel Chachamim. He goes, I heard a rumor the Baitussim were looking for people to go and fool the rabbis, and I figured better for me to go, and then I will reveal their plot rather than someone else goes and maybe gives more believable testimony, and so on. And they told them at the end of the day that they can keep the money. Everything is fine. And but again, I want to pause over here because it's interesting. What was the background of all of this? So the Bavli doesn't tell us the background. The Tosefta in source number 5, so it tells us the same story. Why? That the testimony was there in order to create the new moon at the right day, in order to assure that Chag Shavuot would end, Pesach will be the right day, and the Yom will start the right day, and then Chag Shavuot will be the right day. So if you've ever heard this whole thing about the witnesses and trying to manipulate, so now you realize that that's part of the same story. The Yerushalmi as well does the same thing, and it tells us that the background over here, Shayu Omer Matzeret La'achar Shabbat. So the Yerushalmi follows the Tosefta. The Bavli leaves that out, so you're just kind of wondering, do we have two different dastardly deeds that the Baitussim were doing which are unrelated? And the answer is no. These are related. This is all coming back to the same point. Over here, the Tosefta Pshuta in source number 7, that's Professor Shel Lieberman, who explains a little bit of the background and also goes through a little bit of what the Gersot are. If you're interested, then you will take a look. In source number 8, there's another Tosefta that tells us of another thing that the Baitussim didn't believe in, and they also tried to do something in order to mess up, to make sure that Chazal would not be able to follow their tradition. And there again is a commentary from Professor Lieberman on that in source number 9. In source number 10, there is yet another thing, Lulav Docha to Shabbat. So over here, Vihikiru be'em Baitussim, v'nalav v'kavshim tachat avanim. And the Baitussim, again, here actually they're keeping Shabbat, and it's an exaggerated way of keeping Shabbat, and they go and they hide the Lulavim, and then people find out about it. But again, it's the Baitussim being active and using their power in order to try to frustrate people from following the tradition. We also have another source about Baitussim, where, and this is in source 11 in Tosefta, which talks about Yehuda ben Tabi, Ar Eben Achama im lo harakti eid zomim b'shvil akor milibun shel Baitussim she'omim ad she'areg hanidon. That I'm not doing details today, that they just had a different way of understanding how the law of Eidim Zomim work. So we're finding that it's not a one-topic thing. So we saw the first couple of sources, and we were kind of convinced that maybe that there's a theme over here, but no, there are other issues as well. In source number 12, which is an ancient source called Megillat Ta'anit, here we're told that the Baitussim believed that an individual is allowed to donate the Tamid. The Tamid is a korban tzibur, and therefore should come from the tzibur's money. And we're told that actually there was the Baitussim were in charge of the Beit HaMikdash, and they made sure that individuals were giving the donations for the Tamid. By the way, this also will speak to perhaps an upper class, people with money, and therefore they want to give them a position. We're going to see more about that in a moment. But nonetheless, at the very end of this, we're told, and then they created a holiday based upon the time that Chazal was actually victorious and able to re-establish the tradition that they had against the Baitussim who were running the Beit HaMikdash. And again, that may need a little bit more explanation. In source 13, we have another source, but now we have to pay attention, because now we're switching. Now we're moving from Baitussim to Tzedukim. The only thing is that the conversation is almost the same conversation. Here the topic is whether, well, let me first state a fact. Let's say there's a man who has, who should we use? We'll use Yaakov, and Yaakov has a bunch of sons, and then he has a granddaughter, Serach bar Asher, right? He has a granddaughter as well. And let's just say Yaakov's alive and Asher passes away, and now Serach will inherit. The Tzedukim said, well, if Serach could inherit, then Dinah should also inherit, because the daughter should also inherit, and daughters generally in Jewish law don't inherit. So that's exactly what the discussion here. Tzedukim omrim TORAH Shabbat im bat haben. That's the same kind of phrase. And again, I'm not getting into the discussion, but it's interesting because that's almost word for word the same formula that we had where we started with the Baitussim in Menachot. Over here as well, there's another example in Megillat Tanid. Neshahayu Tzedukim omrim oklim min chat beima. Amalam yochman zaken min ein lechem. V'lo yodim levi raya min haTorah. Ela echad shayu min patpid kenegdo. V'omim neshaya Moshe ohevet Aaron. So why did certain presents or matanot kuhuna go over to the Kohen? And he says because it's Aaron had connections. That basically Moshe likes Aaron or loves Aaron even, and therefore he made sure that the Kohanim are going to get certain gifts. I'm going to say this again, that this kind of argument, and notice at this time, this is Stoki saying this, so this is not a question of not accepting Torah Shebaal Peh, or even reading Torah Shebechtav in a literal sense. This is saying that Moshe made up the Torah, and Moshe therefore played favorites, and this is nepotism, and therefore Moshe gives over to Aaron because let's keep the wealth in the family. So again, this is something which is perhaps not what we had expected. In source 15, we have a Mishnah in Yadayim that speaks about Tzeduki and Prushan. I'm not going to read anything else about this Mishnah, but later on we're going to see one of the commentaries on this Mishnah who's going to help us and be interesting. Okay. If we started today with probably the most famous example of the Baitussim, with the Mesorah Shabbat, I want to now move over to probably the most famous example of the Tzedukim, and that is regarding the avoda of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. We're told in the Mishnah, "Hu parashu bocha v'heim parashu bochim," that they would make him swear that he'll do everything according to tradition, and then he starts to cry, and they start to cry. Hu parashu bocha chashdu tzeduki. He starts to cry because he was accused of being a tzeduki by making him swear. V'heim parashu bochim da amar Reb Shimon Levi kol chol sheb'ksherim loka begufo, because they may have accused an innocent person of something that they never did. V'kol kach lama. Or why do we have to? By the way, this is very similar to the Kol Kach Lama that we had regarding the Omer. Why do we have to do this in such a demonstrative way over here in Kol Kach Lama? In order to make sure that the Kohen Gadol does not get the incense ready on the outside and then carried in. Kiderech shet Tzedukim osam Tana Rabbanan. Once upon a time, the Tzeduki. He did it the way the Tzedukim do it. Again, those of us who don't understand what's exactly going on, one of the things the Kohen Gadol has to do, and it's not that easy. We'll see a source a little bit later on in source 19. It's going to tell us the dexterity needed to do this was quite challenging. Zui me avodot chashot shebemikdash. It was one of the hardest things to do. Essentially, you need to carry the pan in one hand, the pan of coals, and you also need the incense in another hand. And it's essentially juggling a couple of things at once, and it's much easier and more efficient to pour the incense into the coals, and therefore you already have incense when you walk inside, rather than to juggle everything and go inside, keeping everything separate and all the pots and pans separate. So, but by the way, if all that this was about was essentially that the Torah has a right way to do it, and the right way is a little too difficult, so let's just take the easy way out. So that's also really would be quite surprising. I'm not saying it's impossible to understand it that way. It would just be surprising. But it says, once upon a time, a Kohen Tzeduki, he succeeded. Maseh, back in 16, Maseh b'Tzeduki echad, shehitkin v'chutz v'hichnis v'yitziyato yasameach simcha gdola, and this brought him incredible joy. Pogabo aviv, his father sees him. Amal b'ni, Afal Pishet Tzedukim anu, even though it's Tzedukim, mityarin anu min aprushim. We're afraid of them. Omer lo kol yamaya yitim insta'er al mikra hazeh. By the way, I hope you recognize that. It's exactly the speech that Rabbi Akiva gives when he's about to be executed by the Romans. He almost says this word for word, which is interesting because this is certainly before, because this is when the second Beit HaMikdash still stood. Kol yamaya yitim insta'er al mikra hazeh, ki ba'anan er el kaporet. That you go in a cloud. Amarti matayavili. By the way, and here at least he's explaining a verse. And he's explaining the verse. Again, we can argue in terms of pshat. Is that pshat or not? It's pshat maybe of one part of the... It's very selective. Let me put it that way. We'll look at the psuk in a moment. By the way, same words Rabbi Akiva is going to use. If I'm ever going to have the opportunity, will I be able to keep it? And now that I had the opportunity, I'm not going to do it. Not so much time went by until he died. And he was thrown into the garbage, and worms crawled out of his nose. Presumably he did the incense in the wrong way, so his nose gets punished. And some say only when he came out he was struck. That an angel, a sound was heard, an angel came and kicked him alpanav in the face. And there was a footstep of an egel, which on the one hand ties you up with Yecheskel, egel, but on the other hand, we can't ignore about the egel and serving in a wrong way, which ultimately turns into avodah zarah. So as I said, all of that is interesting. In source 17, we're told, and again, this is actually a little frightening, and there's much more to talk about this. Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, because it talks about, this is also in Yom, and it talks about the amount of the Kohanim in the first temple compared to the second temple. So essentially, this is the source that the second temple Kohanim were corrupt. So why were they corrupt? Because they would buy the position. And here it tells us, Kahn b'mikdash rishon, Kahn b'mikdash sheni, Damar Ravasi, Tarkaba dinari ailile, Marta ben Baitus. Notice, we're talking about the Baitussim, and now we have to wonder if Marta bat Baitus, very wealthy woman, she buys it, she gives money, liyamai malka, al de'ukme Yeshua ben Gamla, b'kahani ravrve, in order that Yeshua ben Gamla becomes the Kohen Gadol. Now the reason why this is much more complicated is because Yeshua ben Gamla is generally considered to be a very positive character, and there's a number of things that he does, including starting the school systems, and there's something else that he did in the Beit HaMikdash, which means we're told that somebody from the Baitus family buys the kahuna for Yeshua ben Gamla, and it just sounds that it happens to be that he's the right guy for the job, because he does a nice job with it. So again, this maybe help us a little bit with understanding the background of the second Beit HaMikdash with the Kohanim and the Baitussim. I did nonetheless want to note the pasuk in Parshat Achrei Mot where it says, "V'natana taktoret ala eish lefnei Hashem." So notice pasuk Yud Gimel, and you're going to take the Torah on the fire lefnei Hashem. So there's another lefnei Hashem over here as well. Yud Bet. V'lakach malei amachta gach le'eish me'al mizbeach milefnei Hashem u'meloch alfan v'ketoret samim dakav avim beit lebachoret v'natana takatoret ala eish lefnei Hashem. You do this lefnei Hashem, so presumably lefnei Hashem means in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So to say that that the Tzedukah Kohen Gadol says I always wanted to do this in a different way, it's not such a simple argument that he was telling you pshat in the Chumash and Torah Shabbat comes and twists it about. I think that quite the opposite. I think you read the larger context over here, and it really would seem to be that the way that the psukim should be understood is as Chazal understand it, in that you do the avoda inside. So we already saw 19. We already saw that it's difficult. One of the only reasons source 20 interests me is Rav Yochanan. It's a little later, and Amorim, Rabbi Rav Yochanan, Achamer, Achachelu Tevan Areza Mumer Lahachas Areza Stoki, and now you see Hashmatah Tzensura Min. Here's a perfect example that at least the Gemara that I accessed online had that movement from writing a tzedukah to writing a min, and who knows what other possibilities. And that's what I said in the very beginning, is that whenever we talk about dissidents, we need to be careful because there was some censorship which was taking place. Okay, so all of this was background, and now we can take a look, and we'll start, and we're going to look at the Rambam. And after we read the Rambam, then we'll get back to Rav Soloveitchik. The Rambam deals with Tzedukim in a bunch of places. We're not going to do all of them, and we're certainly not going to do all of them in depth. In Hilchot Shuvah, the Rambam, in passing here, speaking about Shlo Shehim Nikrim Apikorsim, what is it, a person who's actually a heretic? And he writes, somebody who denies here, Ha'omish Ein Torah Mim Hashem Filu Pasuk Echad, somebody denies divine authorship, Afilu Teva Echad, Imam Moshe Amur Pe'atza Reza Kofer B'Torah. So over here is what I think we actually saw, both the Tzeduki and the Baitussim say along the way, but that's not the way the Rabbam quotes it. The Rabbam quotes the next phrase, V'chein HaKofer B'Perusha, V'hu Torah Shebal Peh. That what is, and he's about to tell us now, V'hamachish Magideha, and the person who contradicts those who teach Torah Shebal Peh, Kigon Tzaduk Ubaitus. So it's very interesting, because the Rambam over here could have put Kagon Tzaddik Vaitus in the previous line, and that would have been fallen in line with, again, the more radical positions that we had seen. And again, I don't know if that's representative of all Tzedukim or all Baitussim, or was just that Zakein that was Mitpadpeit, and so on. But the Rambam actually is comparing them to somebody who accepts Torah Shebichtav, but rejects Torah Shebal Peh. This phrase, V'hamachish Magideha, Rav Soloveitchik used it in a very famous and often quoted place where he felt it's not enough even to follow Chazal. One has to love Chazal. One has to be part of the Mesorah. One has to revere the Balei HaMesorah, which I think is the term he would have used over here, the Hamachish Magideha, to say that Chazal didn't know what they were talking about and to give all kinds of new fangled interpretations to ancient sources that go against the Mesorah. The Rabbam felt was kfira, and Rav Soloveitchik echoed this and thought that was kfira, and therefore, and he used this in modern times in order to confront certain positions that were being articulated. But again, he took this right here, Machish Magideha, which he sees as being actually the behavior of Tzaduk and Baitus. And when he mentions in source 22, somebody puts on the tefillin in the wrong way, tefillin shosh al mitzcho, which would be much more beinei necha, that would be very literal, harei derech tzedukim. That's the way the tzedukim do it. In Hilchot Biat HaMikdash, he's referring to how drunk you need to be in order to not be able to go into the Mikdash. And at the end, he says something. He brings the Tzedukim as a halacha. V'im hori b'davash u'mafurish b'Torah ad sheyadu at Tzedukim mutter. He goes, if you know something and you're clear enough to say like really basic things that even a Tzeduki would know, then you're allowed to go inside. So it's interesting, using the knowledge of Tzeduki to be able to know really basic things, that's enough to be able to go in. So just really fascinating that he brings in the Tzedukim over here. Unsurprisingly, in Avodat Yom Kippurim, which is really where we saw the Tzedukim, again, we moved away from the Baitussim a bit, B'mei Beit Sheni Tzatz Haminu Yisrael. And during the Second Temple times, there arose, jumped out, there appeared this minus. Now minus would be, or minut, it would be heresy. V'yotzu tzdukim mehera yavedu. Now this is absolutely fascinating. May they immediately disappear. Now why is that so fascinating? Well, I hope you all understand. What Tzedukim are doing in the Rambam's hometown? There are no Tzedukim there. There's someone else there, which we're going to get to in a second, but there's no Tzedukim there. So the Rambam over here is clear, and again, in the last couple of places as well, when he was talking about the Tzedukim, especially about the tefillin, I have no knowledge. Again, that my lack of knowledge doesn't mean that much. I have no knowledge of the Tzedukim putting on the tefillin the way that the Rambam described in source 22. I do know another group that does it that way, and that's the Kararites. And the Rambam seems to be conflating the Kararites and the Tzedukim as if they are exactly the same. So over here, when he says in the second temple, this new group emerged, the Tzedukim, may they be immediately removed. So again, the Rambam is pretty consistent by saying, they don't believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh, but apparently they believe in Torah Shebechtav. And he goes on to tell that since they were afraid, they would make him swear all the things that we saw in the Gemara before. We'll skip 25. It's a little frightening, this source, because it talks about Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who was a Kohen Gadol for many, many years, and at the end he becomes a Tzedukim. Now, we don't understand that temptation, because I think that we tend to look at the Tzedukim as being very foolish and being very literal and very lacking tradition. How in the world can have a man who's a Kohen Gadol for all those years and suddenly become a Tzedukim? Which means that itself is disturbing. And now we're going to get to the main sources. In the Mishnah, the beginning of a vote, we're told about Antigonus Yishtocho. Now, right away, Antigonus is a name that should get our attention for the very simple reason that Antigonus sounds like Antigone. It sounds very much like a Greek name. We're dealing with the Greek period, the end of the Greek period. We're told Antigonus Yishtocho Kivim Mishimon Atzadik Huya Omer Altiu Kavadim Hamisham Shem Torav Amanat Lekabel Pras. Don't serve God like a servant who is going to work to get a prize, a reward. Elahayu Kavadim Misham Torav. Shalom and not l'kabel pras, not a condition to receive reward. You more shemayim elechem and have the fear of heaven upon you. In Avot Rabbi Natan, and here we have source 27, it tells us this tradition. So it's an interesting addition here that you'll get twice the reward in the world to come. Antigonus Yishsocha Yelu Shnei Talmidim Sheyushonim V'Divreim V'Dvarav V'Yushonim L'Talmidim V'Talmidei Talmidim. He had two students who taught their students and further students moving forward. Amdu V'Diktaku Achareim. They went and they analyzed his words. V'Amru Maru Avoteinu Lomer Dovazeh Efshari Sheyasap Hol Malacha Kol Yom V'Lo Yikabel Schar Ro Arvit. Could it be a man's going to work all day and not be paid at the end of the day? Right? It's against the Torah. Ella ilu hoy yodim avotenu sheyesh olam acher v'yesh tchiyat hametim lo yu omrim kach. If our sages believed that there really was a world to come and there really was tchiyat hametim, there would be people, the dead will come back and live again, they never could have said such a thing. Amdu pirshul min Torah, and they went and separated from the Torah. V'nifritzu mehem shtei pirtzot Tzedukim and Baitussim, and they became two groups, Tzedukim and Baitussim. Tzedukim al shum tzaduk, Baitussi al shem Baitus. V'hayu mishtamshim b'klei kesef v'klei kol yimehem, and they served with things which were quite expensive, which again points towards an aristocratic class. Shelo hayta datan gasa leim elut Tzedukim omim Mesorah hu biyad prushim hein shehein mitzarat tzamol mazeh v'lo maba ein lem klum. That the Prushim, they treat themselves with with a great deal of pain in this world, and the next world there's nothing, and therefore the Tzedukim and the Baitussim said, well, we may as well enjoy this world because it's another world. Now, I of course wonder to what extent this is a latent position which is based upon Greek philosophy. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. There's no other world. There's only over here. Remember some of the sources before, Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Jews and therefore wanted us to have a longer weekend and wanted us to be mitaneg, and especially this coming as students of Antigonus, meaning to what extent were these people raised during that Greek period and therefore influenced by this, and maybe never, we know there were mityavnim, so maybe these are some of those mityavnim who never completely re-entered the society. There's a second tradition of this, and another of Rabbi Natan version. We're going to leave that. If you need to look at it later, you will. Now we have the Rambam, and also in 29 and 30 we have two versions of the Rambam's Perush on Mishnayot. We'll start in 29. וכאשר שמעו שאמר זה המאמר יצאו מלפניו ואמרו אחד מהם לשני הנה הרב כבר ביאר בפירוש שאין שום שכר ולא עונש. There's no reward or punishment. ואין שום תקווה כלל. There's no hope for the future. כי לא הבינו כוונתו עליו ושם, because they really didn't understand it. ונתחברו זה לזה, and it's also the Ram makes it sound like there's really one group. It's interesting, when he spoke about in Avodah Yom Kippur, he said, the time in the Second Temple, there was a group, and he only calls them Tzedukim. Upirshu min Torah. It's funny, because the Rambam's being, again, he's writing in Arabic, so I can't tell you for sure, but if that's a correct translation, he's being cute, because they called the ones who stayed the Perushim, but he's calling these the ones who were Poresh. So as I said, it's being at least a little cute. The Kap says, Lezekad v'lezekad, Yikrum Echemim Tzedukim Baitussim. Vayot shelo yuchlu l'kabetz keilot lefi ma shegiel lahem min ha'emuna. They could not really be successful if they told people what they really believed. Ki zot emuna ra'at tafrid hanikbatzim. It would cause the people gathering around them to leave them. Kol shken shelo tikfotz hanifradim. Holchu acher imuta davar shelo yuchlu lahachzivo eitzel amon. Rather, they chose something which would be an easier sell. Because if they would say what they really believe, they would have been killed. Ritzon Lomar Nusach Torah. Now, that's one version of it. Nusach Torah. I just want to read the second one. It says Ritzon Lomar Divrei Torah. Essentially, what the Rabbam is claiming, and we can easily support this. The Rambam's claiming is that the Tzedukim Baitussim did not believe in the written Torah either. V'tzir kol echad mehem b'leiv siyato shumamin b'nusach Torah, and each one made believe that they believe in the written Torah. V'cholek ala Kabbalah, but they disagree with the tradition. V'shahaya Kabbalah bilti nachon, and they claim that the oral Torah is not right. That way, essentially, they got rid of as much as they could of the functioning Torah. Now, I'm going to say it again. The Rambam is fascinating because the Rambam essentially really is, again, he didn't make the historical link that I'm suggesting. He did not tie them in directly with the Mityavnim, with the Hellenized Jews. But he is claiming that Tzadok and Baitus themselves don't believe in the written Torah or the oral Torah. You can't convince a bunch of Jews, good believing, simple Jews, that the written Torah is not correct, but you can maybe convince them that some of the oral traditions have been passed on incorrectly, right? I have many examples I can give, but I'll actually be nice today. We'll read a little more. V'itrechev lehem gam kein hapetach liparesh lefi shekasher chazar perush v'chuzay yakel b'mashi yitzav yachmir b'mashi yitzel lefi matarato, and therefore people can pick and choose. However, einam amin b'ikar kula, because they don't believe in the very basis at all. V'lo bikshu elo dovish yenoach l'tzap b'nei adam, and they pick things which are easier. Umine az. Now here the Rambam again is going to now make that link that we saw before. Tzomchu eila hakat Ta'orot, Kilo Taminima Sheikru Ba'eretz Hazot, Ritzonu Lomar Mitzrayim, Kra'in, the Kararites, Vishma Meitzachamim Tzedukim Baitussim. So essentially the Rambam is claiming, and this is not a very simple historical claim, the Rambam is claiming that the Kararites in his day and the Tzedukim Baitussim in the Second Temple period are all the same. Now, whether he means they're the same because the Rambam is telling you that the Cheftza, is the same, that they believe in the same kind of thing and it's the same kind of belief, or is the Rambam telling you that no, this is the same people and it's the same lineage, and then therefore the Karayim are the ones who inherited the Tzedukim and Baitussim, which I think would be a little bit more difficult to say, but nonetheless, the Rambam is claiming over here, and he did not say this in the Mishnah Torah. This he's saying in the Parish Mishnayot. He goes a little bit further. There is something similar in the Parish Mishnayot in Chulin, where he goes a little bit further. Let's see, Shaliyat Tzeduki Baitusi V'Hin Shnei Akitot or Katot Sheitchilu Lachish B'Devrei Kabbalah. Remember, Machish Magideha. They were the ones that Chish Devrei Kabbalah, K'mo Shidvarti Bavot, Ad Sheshav Emet Etzlam Sheker V'Nitiveya Or Choshech V'Avhila B'Eretz Nochachot. And again, he comes to the lands that we live right now, and again, he's drawing the connection between the Tzedukim, the Baitussim, and the Kararites. Rav Yisrael Lifshitz in the Tiferet Yisrael, he does not go that way. He knows, probably, I'm sure he knows this Rambam. And remember I quoted a Mishnah in Yadayim a while back. So he is commenting on that Mishnah, and he talks about these two bad groups, Shatu ha'am miderach ha'makubal, lanu mipi Moshe Rabbenu, aval him kafru b'kabbalah, u'pir shatorah kafi datam nifsedet. Now, he does not say that they denied Torah Shebechtav. Again, we saw a particular Baitussim, we saw a particular Tzedukim who did. He does not go that far. And again, you do have to wonder about the influences of Greek philosophy. Then, and right in other words, Baitus, and then we'll skip a little bit. Aval, back over here, Hakaraim, Katra'a Achereti. There's a whole different group called the Karaim. And they emerge at a much later time. Lo Shelo Mano Nasi. L'chein Yatsa v'hitpaker v'kichash l'Torah Shebal Peh. Upirish Gamo Torah Kefia Nire Lo. Ba'ofen Acher Mimash Upirish Tzedukim Baitus. And he says, no, they don't have the same beliefs. It's completely different. There's nothing which is similar between them. And each one did do some things properly, and each one according to what they believed. All of them believe in Scripture. Again, not like the Gemara we started with. And so here he thinks that the Karayim are really quite different from the Tzedukim and the Baitussim. Just to make things a little bit difficult, we find over here Tosefta, which we learned last week, that Rabbi Leil had his Seder Bebeit Baitus ben Zunin. So who's this Baitus ben Zunin? And Baitus ben Zunin, by the way, Zunin actually had a very good position, and Baitus had a very significant position. And what is Rabbi Leil doing with them? Is this? Come on, let's be honest. It could be just a coincidence. It could be the same name. It doesn't have to be Baitussim per se. Although notice Rabbi Leil gets into an argument with other Chachamim regarding Erevin. Amar Gamliel, Ma'aseh b'Tzedukim echad she'adar imanu. Tzedukim man dachar shmei. What is Tzedukim? I mean, the problem is making an Erev with somebody who's not Jewish. That one opinion is that a Tzedukim is like a Nachri, and you can't include him in the Erev. For Rabbi Leil, Tzedukim ain't no Nachri. And then he goes and talks about a Tzedukim who lived in his neighborhood and had a very good relationship with him. There, by the way, are reasons I'm quoting this as well, just in terms of our topic also. And it's very interesting, though, that Rabbi Leil takes this position. As I said, I don't know how far to put this, but I will leave it at that. Is there anything else that I want here? Yeah, well, we can skip a whole bunch of these. And now we'll look at source 37. And then we're going to get to something Rabbi Soloveitchik said in passing about this. The Gemara over here tells us, starting actually with the Mishnah, there was a takana made that when one person says to his friend, "How are you?" you say it b'shem. Shenem avini boaz ba mi beit lechem v'yomer lekotzrim Hashem imachem v'milo yivrecha Hashem v'omer Hashem imcha gibur chayil v'omer al tivos chizuk imecha v'omer eit laHashem afru toratecha. Now, just pause with all this. Who gave them permission to say Shem Hashem? I'm allowed to say Shem Hashem when I say a bracha. I'm allowed to say Shem Hashem in certain situations. Why are you allowed to say Shem? It says Vitzkinu. So here in the Rishimot Shiurim, Rav Soloveitchik has a long explanation for this phenomena. Vitzkinu she'ad shol Shem Hashem. What's the background and why they're doing it. And he goes to various Rishonim, why this may be problematic. But at some place towards the end, he comes and he says the following. V'nei Rambam, hishmit takanazu. The Rambam left out this takana. That you bless your friends with God's name. V'tzarchin b'tamo. And why would the Rambam do this? V'yitachein, it's possible to sover de b'shol b'shem chal isa demoti shem shemayim d'vatala. And this is also part of a much larger distinction between the Baitussim versus the Rambam about what is considered to be saying God's name in vain. By the way, nonetheless, the Gemara says that you do it. The lo dami l'tzvila v'rak tiknu harad shah l'shol b'shem. Says no, it must be the Rambam understood it as a temporary injunction. V'yeshlos of Dichin de Nechleku Rashi Rami Yisod Takana the Rashis of Shigmulu Shel Shalom Chaver B'Shem Mishum Bakei Shalom V'Erd Fehu V'ilu Ram Sover Dach Takana mi Shach Shaykh Takana de Misha Kilkalu Hat Tzedukim V'Om She'ena Olam Ela Echad de Tiknu Lomer Mina Olam V'Ad Olam. So the Rav here says something which is brilliant. He says, why would you use God's name, and why would you say that God is Me'olam V'Ad Olam? It must be to counter somebody who doesn't believe this. So therefore, how do you counter the Tzedukim or the Baitussim who are spreading around this belief that there's no other world? You swear in God's name that there is another world when you meet another Jew in order to instill within them the belief. The Gam Genushe Adam Shoel B'Shem. V'yesh shaychut ben shnei hatakanot t'tervayu nitku mishakilkalu atzedukim v'nitku kedei lahotzila milibun shel atzedukim. And this takana comes about during the time of Tzedukim in order to weaken the Tzedukim. V'yisod takana l'sker t'shem hu kedei l'chazek t'munah b'shkacha pratit, in order that people should know that God is in our lives. V'rak lamdu mi Boaz d'yesh makor l'shot chaver b'shem. And the only reason to Boaz is there we find a source. Achat takana nitka achakach b'mei bait sheni. But this takana really must have been by the Second Temple period. So the Rav then says, so it makes sense. This was only in order to get rid of the Tzedukim. Now, what question would I then have on this? The question I would have is I'd try to point out a whole bunch of cases where the Rabbam is claiming that Tzedukim and the Kararites are the same thing. So if they're the same thing, then any takana against the Tzedukim should still be a takana against the Kararites. And therefore, instead of the Rabbam not quoting this because it doesn't apply in his time, if the Rabbam believed Tzedukim are still around and they're still doing the same thing, so then you should still have the same takana. Unless you're going to say that the Rabbam believes that when it comes to 98% of the things, the Kararites and the Tzedukim are the same. But when it comes to this particular thing, they're not the same, so therefore there's a downside to this. The downside is saying God's name in vain. You can't say God's name in vain. Chazal thought there was a purpose for it, but if the purpose no longer exists, the thing you're trying to counter no longer exists, so therefore the Rabbam doesn't bring this down because it's not there. But as I said, we saw a whole bunch of, meaning if the Rav were here today, and the Rav pulled out this parish and explained the Rambam. Why does the Rambam bring this takana? Because it was only against the Tzedukim. Therefore, it's harad shah. It's not needed. I would ask him, but what about the Rambam in 1, 2, 3 places we saw today that he says that the Tzedukim and the Kararites are the same? So how would you explain that? So, as I said, we could try to guess what answer he would give, and he certainly would have had an answer. Believe me, we are not going to pull out a Rambam that he didn't know. He knew the Rambam better than you know Ashrei. He knew it absolutely with clarity, and he worked out every single Rambam. And if he said this, that means that even though it looked really similar to us, and we were convinced, and we were reading this, that the Tzedukim and the Kararites are absolutely the same, it must be that they're almost the same. They're absolutely the same, except in the ways that they're not the same, and the ways that they're not the same. And therefore, we saw that Yisrael saying, no, they're absolutely not the same, except for the ways that they are the same. And we see that the Rav said, based on the Rambam, look, they're absolutely the same. Again, the Rambam is saying they're absolutely the same, except for the places that they're not the same. So it must be that it's not the same. Just to get one last thing, because this is actually important. There's a footnote to this, and the footnote is footnote number 3, and it says that Rabbi Rabbenu, and the Rav quoted Reb Chaim, Shemoren Agrach, Reb Chaim, Lo nahag l'chtov Baruch Hashem b'tchilach nichtavav, and therefore Reb Chaim would not write Baruch Hashem on the top of his letter head, or when he would write letters, B'shem de Rabbam hishmida takana l'shol b'shalom chaver b'shem, because the Rambam leaves this out. He doesn't say that you use the Shem Hashem, so therefore he leaves out the Baruch Hashem on the top of the page when he would write letters. So, and this is also very typical of the Rav, to along the way bring a Reb Chaim who is medayik from a Rambam, and then uses it absolutely in life. And I'm going to bring you one last thing. There is a Gemara here in source 40 in Sukkah. It says, it's a Mishnah. Shepam echad nitzach echad al gabe raglav rigmo kol ha'am be'etrogayim. That there was once a Kohen who does the nitzach of a Mayim, he does this in the wrong way, and everybody pelts the fellow with etrog. So the Rav explains, and there's something very important about what the Rav says over here, and you don't always get this when you read things from the Rav. Certain times he said things with absolute seriousness, and as if the whole world depended on that interpretation at that particular moment. But then there were things that he said with a smile on his face, and he had a very, very nice smile and a very broad smile. And when he said it, he knew that it was amusing. And this was said with a smile. It says that once, and by the way, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that he said it with a smile. It says, and they threw the etrog. He goes, Yesh ear. One should note. Madurag modafka betrogim. Why did they throw an etrog at him? There's a lot of laws of Sukkot which are based on Torah Shabbat Peh. Kagon, Nisuch Hamayim and Chula. I mean, just think about all the laws of building the Sukkah. Gam Shah Etrog, who creates Hadar, the fact that the etrog is the pre-Eitz Hadar, Yadurak Me'alach Moshe B'Sinai. It's the only way that we know this. Bizrikat etrogeim ala menasech shelo kibel et halacha Moshe B'Sinai shel nisuch hamayim b'chag. By throwing the etrog at the fellow who doesn't believe in halacha Moshe B'Sinai, nemar lo she'im misarev lekabel et Torah Shabbat Peh nisuch hamayim minayin lo sheprietz hadar hakatuv v'torah hu etrog ulai pri acherhu ukeshem shemakabel et Mesorah al peh to pre-Eitz hadar hu etrog kach tzarich lekabel Mesorah shel nisuch hamayim. So they're saying a svara with the etrog, and that's where they're throwing the etrog, that the etrog is a cheftza of Torah Shabbat Peh, and they're throwing the Torah Shabbat Peh at him and hitting the fellow in the head with the etrogim, because the etrog is the cheftza of Torah Shabbat Peh, said over to the fellow who doesn't believe in that particular tradition of Torah Shabbat Peh. As you see, I collected a lot. I have more, not everything we're going to read. And you know what? The Rav would not have given this shir. I can absolutely assure you. The Rav would have used less sources, and his analysis would have been much sharper, and he would have said something which would have cut through everything, and then you would all have been convinced that every word was absolutely correct, because that's what happens when he spoke. But on the other hand, we did get to quote him a little bit, and we saw enough of the sources to appreciate when he said was not the simplest thing to have said, but nonetheless, it ends up becoming the way to resolve and to put all the sources together, and that was important. At the end of the day, the sources had to come together, and what we see is that there was a battle between those who keep Torah Bichtav, or maybe I'll say this differently, those who follow the Mesorah and those who don't. Rav Soloveitchik's life was dedicated to following the Mesorah, both on a personal sense, but also in a way of passing it over to others. And the fact that there were dissidents who lived a long time ago, and then the Rambam points out, and you know what, and there were dissidents who live in our time as well, talking about the Rambam's time in Egypt, the Kararites. In our lifetimes, there are also dissidents around. There are groups who don't necessarily follow the Torah Shabbat Peh. And then that's what I hinted at along the way, that the Rav created the best ability for us to defend our belief, to protect our belief, to protect our system, to protect our Mesorah, to be Mbale Mesorah, to pass over our tradition to our children and to our grandchildren. But at the same time, on a personal level, there were members of the Reform and the conservative movements who felt very comfortable to call him up and to ask him questions, and on a personal level felt that he was somebody who they can talk to, even though, again, on a different level, his life was completely dedicated towards passing on the Mesorah, and therefore this fight against those against the Mesorah, whether it has to do with the Omer, and maybe think about this a little more now as we're counting the Omer, whether it's about the Avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, or other places that people came in to try to argue with what our tradition is, that our passing on our tradition, our being engaged in it, and the tools that we have, and I'll say this again, maybe there was nobody in our lifetimes who gave us the tools as much as Rabbi Soloveitchik did, because the way and the method and the approach and the thinking and the articulation, all of it was absolutely dedicated to the past, but putting it in a way that we could present it in the present and towards the future, and again, that the Mesorah will live, and this old ancient religion, which could have been rejected long ago, instead becomes something which is absolutely vibrant and absolutely enchanting, is really the present that he left us with. And his words are absolutely just as relevant today as they were 31 years ago when he passed away.
Against the Mesorah.
Yes, you have a very 19th century question. looking for broad, big systems, and one answer which will explain everything. I'm not sure. I mean, yes, I was thinking in the same direction, but then again, some of this was Tzedukim and some of this was Baitussim. So there's not necessarily going to be a commonality between what they're looking at. If you take, for example, the Tzedukim's understanding that you have to walk in already enclosed with a cloud, that could indicate this need for distance from God. The God is too great, and therefore we can't possibly approach God without some kind of a protection. But it's also interesting because the real argument between the Tzedukim and between Chazal was not just accepted traditions. The Tzedukim actually, that's really was the TORAH Yisrael's point. They accepted a lot of tradition. The Tzedukim didn't argue how you do Shechita. Shechita is completely based upon Torah Sheba'al Peh. Right? It doesn't say any place how do you do Shechita. So if you only accept Torah Sheba'al Peh, not Torah Sheba'al Peh, how do you do Shechita? So they accepted Shechita. They really didn't accept the ability of Chazal to make new interpretations, which means there seems to be, again, this covering up, this sense or this feeling that God is too great and how can I possibly form a partnership with God? And therefore maybe it is a fear of the holy. Maybe that's really what it is, a fear of the holy. But again, I'm afraid to try to say and give an interpretation that will be broad in every single case. And again, some of the sources that we saw were much worse than that. They made these people sound that they absolutely did not believe, not just in Torah Sheba'al Peh, they didn't believe in Torah Sheba'al Tav either. And, we saw the Rabbam say that as well. And there was to support, meaning if I then ask myself, okay, where did the Rabbam get that from? That's exactly where we started. He says, Moshe loved the Jews and Moshe made all this stuff up. Stop. Moshe made this up. So yeah, you'll have people today who are going to take the same position. But again, I question whether that was the thought of every single Baitussi or not, or every single Tzeduki or not, and I don't know the answer to that question.